Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 61 of the Aviation News Talk podcast, where we bring you general aviation news and relevant information that pilots like you can hopefully use someday. Today, we're talking about preventing airplane accidents and about the go-around maneuver. Now, personally, I don't think the go-around gets the attention it deserves, as I continue to see people fail to execute the maneuver when it's needed most. And I'm amazed by all the simple ways that pilots can just screw up this maneuver. Plus, we'll also be sharing listener feedback and answering some listener questions. Plus, coming up in the news, the GAO, that's the Government Accountability Office, has just issued a report on an aspect of the aviation industry that we've talked about multiple times on this show. And Cessna has just quietly discontinued one of their general aviation models. And finally, one country is talking about rule changes for the air traffic controllers that would have them working 9.5-hour shifts and eliminate their potty breaks. Welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk about general aviation. I'm Max Trescott. I'm here to educate and inform you as a pilot or a student pilot and hopefully have some fun in the process. Along the way, I'll be sharing my over 40 years of experience as a certificated pilot. I'm author of the G1000 Glass Cockpit Handbook and the 2008 National Flight Instructor of the Year here in the United States. And these days, I specialize in Cirrus aircraft like the SR20 and SR22. Now, last week in episode 60, we talked with Mike McIntyre about his experience buying a used SR22 and flying it back with me from California to Georgia. So if you missed that episode, you might want to check it out. Of course, this week we're going to talk about preventing accidents and the proper use of the go-around maneuver. All this and more, and the news starts now. From the GAO.gov and avweb.com, the GAO reports on the pilot supply issue. Now, flight schools are finding it hard to retain their instructor ranks because airlines are hiring away their staff, a government study reported this week. At the same time, flight schools find it challenging to recruit new students due to the high cost of training, which often exceeds $50,000 on top of tuition. The U.S. Government Accountability Office said it undertook the study to address concerns about the supply of airline pilots. In response to these challenges, schools have raised instructor pay and airlines have offered tuition reimbursement, the GAO found. Also, the Federal Transportation Department has launched an initiative to assess the level of interest among veterans in becoming pilots and to examine strategies for employing them in pilot jobs. Now, that study from the GAO surveyed 147 schools. Representatives from the schools told them that they could use more help from the airlines. For example, one school negotiated an agreement with one airline to initially hire its graduates as part-time pilots, yet allow them to continue working part-time as flight instructors. School representatives said the airline benefits because the school is able to produce more qualified candidates for their hiring needs. Representatives of one pilot school told the researchers they are working with airlines to change the seniority system so pilots can get their seniority number while they are still instructors. This could reduce the strong incentive to become an airline pilot as quickly as possible. We've put the full text of the study up on our Patreon site, and you'll also find it in the show notes. From flyingmagazine.com, distracted taxiing is a factor in ground incidents and runway incursions. According to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, distracted driving killed 3,450 people in 2016 and contributed to more than 391,000 injuries in 2015. And though the numbers are lower, a distracted taxiing accident can be just as costly or even deadly. In a 2015 study by the MITRE Corporation analyzing 1,782 records from the FAA Runway Safety Database, within the subset of incidents involving aircraft taxiing for departure, 40% of pilots reported distraction in the cockpit at the time of the incident. An earlier FAA study of wrong runway departures reported that out of 80 incidents where the air crew were cleared to one runway but departed from or taxied onto a different runway, 9 listed distractions as a factor. For those actually killed during a runway incursion, of course, we'll never know whether distraction was a factor. The lesson here is clear. The time you spend taxiing the airplane should involve only that task. Others can wait until you've safely stopped in the run-up area or at the runway hold short line. From setting frequencies and flight plans to completing pre-flight checklists and talking to passengers, pilots have multiple opportunities for distractions while taxiing. When pilots are new and must concentrate on using their feet to steer, they tend to focus on the process of taxiing. But as pilots gain more experience, they begin to feel more comfortable multitasking during taxi operations, even to the point of performing rolling run-ups, which of course would be trying to do your run-up while you're taxiing. For single pilot operations, multitasking while taxiing can be dangerous as texting while driving. The bottom line, take the extra minutes to set up your frequencies, tablet, or FMS system prior to taxiing. Do your run-up at a stop, put the cell phone away and concentrate only on taxiing. To paraphrase an anti-texting while driving slogan, multitasking and taxiing, there are stupider things, but it's a very short list. And I have to confess, this is one of my pet peeves. I see people trying to do all kinds of things while they're taxiing, and I've also seen people ignore the fact that they have an airplane that sticks out 20 feet on each side. It's as if they think they're driving a car that's 6 feet wide. So, yeah, definitely pay more attention to taxiing, and you'll avoid incidents. Also from avweb.com, aviation organizations seek weather station access. Now, 14 aviation organizations, including AOPA, EAA, and GAMA, are asking the FAA to reconsider its position on not allowing pilots access to weather data from hundreds of non-federal weather stations. Currently, non-federal weather stations must be equipped with AWOS 3 or better to be included in the FAA's Weather Message Switching Center Replacement, that's WMSCR, which collects, processes, and disseminates aviation weather products to the National Airspace System, airlines, international, and commercial users. Now, by the way, AWOS 3 is one of the few that I know. As I recall, that means a WAS system that can detect precipitation, so it can notify you automatically if it's raining at that location. Now, a lot of AWASs obviously don't have that capability. The organization sent a joint letter to the FAA last August asking the agency to remove the AWOS 3 requirement and to change the VFR weather station standard to include fewer maintenance visits. The letter states the inclusion of data from lower-level and non-AWOS stations has the potential to increase safety, help prevent unintentional flight into IMC, and assist with go, no-go decision-making. Reducing required maintenance visits will, the groups believe, save money without impacting safety. The FAA denied the request, but both AOPA and EAA have said they are continuing to pursue the issue. The FAA told AvWeb that the AWOS 3 requirement is in place in order to meet national and international policy requirements. The agency went on to say that, quote, it is reviewing current policies and investigating refinements to procedures and infrastructure as part of future acquisitions under next-gen weather systems. From AOPA.org, Cessna discontinues their Turbo Skyhawk JT-A. Cessna Aircraft quietly discontinued the sale of its diesel engine-equipped Skyhawk less than a year after the aircraft was certified in 2017. A Textron Aviation spokesperson confirmed on May 8 that the aircraft had been removed from the Textron website. Spokesman said, quote, the Turbo Skyhawk JTA option will no longer be offered through Textron Aviation. The Continental CD-155 engine is now offered directly through Continental as an STC installation for the Cessna Skyhawk 172. Installation can be facilitated and accomplished by Continental after the aircraft acceptance and delivery from Textron Aviation. The spokesperson offered no specific reasons for the decision other than to comment that Textron continuously monitors the market and adjusts its product offering as necessary. Now, diesel-powered aircraft are getting fairly popular outside the U.S. simply because avgas prices are so high, but for some reason they don't seem to be getting as much traction here in the United States. I've got probably a couple hundred hours in the diesel-powered Diamond DA40NG, which is a great aircraft and only sips about 6.5 gallons per hour while flying about 125 to 130 knots. From the Daytona Beach News Journal, flight controllers talked down an Embry-Riddle student pilot after oil blocks the windshield. About 3,000 feet off the ground, the young pilot stuck his hand out the window of his single-engine plane to touch the fluid building up on the windshield. He then contacted the tower saying, Daytona approach, Riddle 632. I have a weird liquid forming on my window. I reached out and touched it. It's thick. It seems to be oil, like I have an oil leak. Can I get a landing immediately? The drama that unfolded would last about 7.5 minutes on April 26, but it will certainly endure a lifetime in the memory of the student pilot who was flying blind and the two FAA air traffic controllers who worked together to guide him to a safe landing. 4 times during those 7 minutes on a frequency that can be heard by other nearby flyers, the pilot said he wanted to land as soon as possible. 7 other times he said he could not see what was in front of him. Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University declined to release any information or the pilot's name, citing the ongoing investigation. But we're happy that that was a happy outcome for November 632 Echo Romeo. In international news, and this comes first from Canada, from Copa National, that's the Canadian Owner Pilots Association, Nav Canada recently released their aeronautical study pertaining to the planned NavAid modernization project. The study is available to all for review on the COPA website at copanational.org. This project proposes to decommission most NDBs and very high VHF frequency VORs across the country in favor of a satellite-based navigation system. The proposed system has been under discussion for some time, and COPA has had numerous meetings and discussions with both TCCA and Nav Canada. In the process, Nav Canada has maintained that they have led an extensive consultation with all stakeholders across the country, a claim that COPA does not support based on the information they have gathered. Nonetheless, the study presents a compendium with the feedback that Nav Canada received from some customers. Note that the study does reflect some of the concerns that COPA voiced to Nav Canada and includes the results of their consultation process as well as their responses in mitigation. Now, in this note to their members, COPA says, "We would greatly appreciate your reviewing this document and including your aviator colleagues and giving us your feedback on the impact of this project on small GA aircraft operations. We recognize that this is a complex document and we are happy to offer some guidance with respect to it." And at the bottom here, they say they would appreciate receiving feedback to their office at operations@copanational.org by May 31st, which will enable them to include it in discussions at the COPA convention on June 21st to 23rd, 2018. Now, the original article didn't have a link to the study, but I subsequently found one, and we'll include that in the show notes. And from australiaflying.com.au, associations have signed up for the Act Change Summit. Australia's aviation associations have signed up en masse to attend a summit in Wagga Wagga with the aim of instigating changes to the Civil Aviation Act of 1988. The summit, organized by the Australian General Aviation Alliance, or AGAA, was originally planned for early June, but has been pushed back to July 9th and 10th. According to Ben Morgan, CEO of AOPA Australia, 28 associations have registered to attend the summit. He said the participation of the vast majority of Australia's general aviation industry associations conveys a clear message to both the minister and government that our industry is determined to end aviation decline, seeking a cooperative transition toward growth and opportunity through a positive change to the Civil Aviation Act, he said. The Civil Aviation Act contains a directive that Civil Aviation Safety Authority must regard safety as the absolute priority when creating regulation, which disregards the costs that are imposed upon general aviation. It is this that the AGAA Summit is looking to change. Now, the cause was supported by aviation activist Dick Smith in a speech made in Wagga Wagga in April, in which Smith proposed a new wording for the act that removed the safety imperative. And finally, also from Down Under, I have to say that I'm not occasionally above a little bit of potty humor, but this is no laughing matter for air traffic controllers in New Zealand. According to tvnz.co.nz, many New Zealand air traffic controllers face the possibility of 9.5-hour shifts with no potty break. Many air traffic controllers are completing shifts without the certainty of a regular toilet break, the union representing them has told the Education and Workforce Select Committee. The New Zealand Airline Pilots Association, that's NZALPA, represents nearly every air traffic controller in the country and said changes to the proposed Employment Relations Amendment Bill, otherwise known as the ERA Bill, were safety critical to allow air traffic control staff a break. The NZALPA said proposed legislation could require air traffic controllers to work without any breaks up to 9.5 hours. NZALPA president and international airline pilot Tim Robinson said that air traffic is widely recognized as one of the most stressful occupations in the world, with the highest need for mental alertness, and restricting the ability for air traffic controllers from having normal breaks like other workers is irresponsible and unsafe. He said the lack of breaks could lead to a serious incident or accident. Quote, many ATCs, particularly those based at regional airports, are often solo controllers working the shift by themselves. This means that they have the sole duty to ensure that the aerodrome and surrounding airspace remains safe. The proposed ERA bill excludes those employed in essential services, including air traffic controllers, from mandatory meal and rest breaks. The proposed ERA bill reflects the wording of the current legislation, and NZLPA is calling for it to be amended to allow air traffic controllers the same meal and rest breaks as other workers. And Mr. Robinson says in many comparable jurisdictions such as Canada, every control tower is routinely staffed by more than one person. In many countries in the European Union, it is a legal requirement to have more than one person on duty following fatal accidents in the past. And he says, does New Zealand have to wait for a major accident to occur in order to highlight the need for proper rest and meal breaks to be legislated? Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up, we're going to talk about the importance of the humble go-around maneuver in preventing accidents and the many ways that I see pilots screwing up this maneuver, plus listener feedback and questions. One listener wants to know, why does it seem that I'm usually flying VFR versus IFR on long ferry trips across the country like the one we talked about in episode 60? Stick around. We'll be right back here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And welcome back. And before we talk about go-around related accidents and how to perform the go-around, let me give you a few quick updates. First, our question of the month. This is where we need you to contact me and give me your thoughts on this question. This relates to Jaden, who's starting his internship at Garmin. And he said, what are your biggest issues with modern avionics systems? Are there specific features you feel they lack? Also, what future avionics technologies are you most excited about? We're going to crowdsource this one. So far, I've gotten just one email, and what I really like would be a number of folks to give us some audio recordings telling us what you think. I'll need that audio by the end of the day on May 25th, which is only about a week away, and you can record that with the voice memo on your smartphone, or you can go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on listener questions and record up to 90 seconds with SpeakPipe, which will then get emailed to me, or you can just write up an email and put the words intern audio in the subject line. And you can send it directly to one of my most used email addresses, info, I-N-F-O, at SJ Flight. That's SJ, short for San Jose Flight.com. That'll come straight to me. Put intern audio in the subject and answer either one or all three of these questions. What has been your biggest issue with modern avionics systems? Are there specific features you feel they lack? What about future avionics technologies are you most excited about? So please send that to me here in the next week, and we'll use those in a future show, and we'll give Jaden some feedback that he can use hopefully in his internship. Let's see, it looks like I'm headed back to Knoxville again in early June. Going to be bringing back a new Cirrus with an owner. Gentleman has previously owned other Cirruses, and he just traded that one in, and I guess he's got a new one coming. So that'll be fun flying back to Monterey, California with him. And I just came back from a week of vacation. I had great fun visiting two national parks that I have never been to. We flew into Las Vegas commercially on Southwest and rented a 7-passenger minivan. It took a family of 6, so my kids and their husbands and boyfriends and so on. We went up first to Bryce Canyon, which is just an amazing national park. Never been there before. Super colors in all the rocks. Took lots of great pictures. Didn't spend a lot of time talking to a whole lot of people there, but I did happen to bump into an air traffic controller. Who would have thought? Of the few people that I talked to while I was up there, I ran into controller Mike and his wife Kristen from Twin Falls, Idaho. So if you know Mike, or if you're involved with air traffic control in Twin Falls, Idaho, please give a shout out to him for me. He was there with his lovely wife, their 3 kids, and they asked me to take their picture on the Rim Trail, which is just a gorgeous spot, and we talked for a few minutes. So that was fun to make his acquaintance. From there, we drove down to Zion National Park, which again was totally spectacular. It was pretty hot the first day, about 95 degrees. I stayed in and did some riding for a couple of days while the family was out riding horseback and doing a couple of other things, so everybody else had a good time. I did see the Bryce Canyon Airport when I was there. Now, talk about density altitude issues. Our lodgings were at 7,700 feet, so we were pretty high, and we could definitely notice that when we were walking around. Looked like the airport's a little lower, but certainly if you're flying into any of these high-altitude airports, as summer approaches in particular, think about density altitude. We'll probably talk about that in an upcoming show. Hey, speaking of upcoming events, I am going to be in Missoula, Montana on June 15th and 16th at one of the AOPA regional fly-ins. They have hired me to give a seminar. Now, if you're not able to get to Missoula, there are going to be 3 other fly-ins scheduled around the country, and you might be able to meet up me at one of those. So in the fall, they're going to be at Santa Fe, New Mexico, Carbondale, Illinois, and Gulf Shores, Alabama, where coincidentally I've been to all three of those places, all great towns. But this will be my first time to Missoula. It's coming up really quickly, so you're going to want to register soon. And it's a 2-day event. On Friday, there are workshops for which there is a fee. It's $99. And essentially what you do is you're going to buy a ticket to attend the all-day Friday workshops, and then you can pick any two of the workshops that are most interesting to you. They're offered in 2 3-hour sessions. AOPA says the workshops will provide in-depth opportunities to roll up your sleeves, deepen your skill in your choice of 2 of the 8 subject areas being offered by world-class presenters. Thank you very much. So the 9 a.m. sessions include owner-performed aircraft maintenance, VFR backcountry flying adventure, IFR beginner, rusty IFR refresher, and aviation photography. There's then a complimentary lunch for ticket holders from 12 to 1. And then from 1 to 4 o'clock will be owner-performed aircraft maintenance part 2, VFR advanced 500 miles and beyond, IFR Advanced Skills and Proficiency for the Active IFR Pilot, and that's the session that I'm teaching. And finally, a session called Why Good Pilots Make Bad Choices. So registration is required in advance, $99, including lunch. Now, Saturday is the free day, and they're going to have a pancake breakfast starting at 8 o'clock, so I'll definitely be there for that. I try not to miss those. And then they have some free seminars throughout the day from 9 a.m. to 2:45 p.m. Too many of them to mention, but just kind of glancing at the sheet here, I see, let's see, what your engine is really telling you. STOL, so that would be short takeoff and landing for the masses. What's new with ForeFlight? A case study from an NTSB investigator. Why Good Pilots Make Bad Decisions, Cirrus XM, What You Need to Know About In-Flight Weather by Scott Denstedt, an ADSB case study exploring solutions for every aircraft, Avidyne Advanced IFR Tips, and it goes on and on and on. And then at 3 o'clock will be the Town Hall and Ice Cream Social with AOPA President Mark Baker. So if you have any opportunity to get yourself to Missoula on June 15th and 16th, definitely do that. I'll be there both on Friday and Saturday, and I look forward to seeing you there. And if not, look for me in the fall at either Gulf Shores, Alabama, Carbondale, Illinois, or Santa Fe, New Mexico. And just a quick update on the Raspberry Pi-based live sectional maps that some of us are building together. Moj tells me that he has just ordered his parts. I think Ron Klutz has just about finished his. I'll post a picture of that when that's done. I have not been able to go further on mine since I've been out of town, but hope to make some more progress in the next couple of days. And Bill Bryson, who's the gentleman who has put together an amazingly detailed website with how to make these live sectional maps with lights that show you the flight conditions, whether they're IFR or VFR and so on. Well, Bill has just put together a new video, runs about 10, 11 minutes, and it shows you step by step how to put the hardware together. It couldn't be simpler. So I'm going to go ahead and post a link on our Patreon site, and you'll also find it in the show notes. Just click on that link, and you can see the video and all the details on how to build one of these maps yourself. And if you decide to do it, just go ahead and send a few bucks to Bill. I sent him $30 over PayPal. He saved me hours, and I thought that was just kind of a nice way to give back to someone who's literally spent a couple of months documenting how to do these really cool maps. Speaking of Patreon, hey, I want to thank all the new supporters we've gotten since the last episode, and those new supporters include Nick Herring, Emerson Allen, Brian Brisk, who's coming back with us. He'd been gone for a while. Shay Mann, Kurt Taylor, Rob Thomas, Lyman Howard, who I did some consulting with last year, and Arthur Waite edited his pledge up to $10 a month. So if you're not familiar with our Patreon site, just head on out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And if you really like this show, that's a place where you can go to get just a few extra little tidbits that are not included in the show here. And if you'd like to join as a supporter, it's pretty easy to sign up to give us a few bucks a month via credit card. Speaking of the Patreon page, some of the stories we've listed here over the last week or so. Posted a video recently of some cops in Brazil who were chasing down a Piper Saratoga on a runway and then basically rammed that aircraft to stop it. So that's a pretty amazing video. And also posted Bill Bryson's video with the step-by-step how to build the live sectional map. So just go on out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. It's a free site. You can look at all the videos and things that we post. And again, if you'd like to make a contribution, you're welcome to do that. Now stick around because in 7 seconds, we're going to be talking about the go-around and how to avoid accidents with timely go-arounds. So please stay with us. Hey, welcome back. Let's talk about preventing airplane accidents and the go-around maneuver. Yeah, I sometimes wonder if pilots don't do go-arounds when they know that they probably should, simply because pride gets in the way. As you get more experienced, you start to think, well, I'm so good I never have to do a go-around and I can save just about any landing, so I'll just go ahead and continue to try to make this work, even though sometimes it doesn't work out. So all I can say is let's not be too prideful, because not all landings are meant to be. So if this one is not working out, just go around, please. All right, let's talk about some recent accidents, some fatal, some not, and how it relates to the go-around maneuver. As I said earlier, I just don't think the go-around gets the respect that it deserves or the attention for several reasons. First, I think CFIs don't practice it enough with pilots during flight training. I certainly probably don't practice it with my students enough. And pilots probably don't practice it much after they pass their private check ride. I think pilots may think, hey, it's a simple maneuver, I don't need to practice it, or perhaps they feel, hey, they're such a good pilot that they can save any bad approach or landing and they just don't need to do a go-around. Regardless, I continue to be amazed at the number of accidents that occur because either people didn't do a go-around because they thought they could make the landing work, or when they do go around, the poor technique that I sometimes see. And just so you don't think it's only low-time GA pilots who screw up the go-around, I will always remember a comment from an airline pilot friend of mine just a couple of years ago. He flies for one of the 4 major airlines here in the United States. And he said, Max, when we're flying in the airlines, we rarely have to do a go-around for real. But of course, we do practice it all the time in the simulator. But he said, when we occasionally have to do it for real, it seems like we always seem to forget at least one thing when we perform it. So think about this. If an airline pilot can forget something while doing a go-around, first, it tells you a couple things. One, that it's not a trivial maneuver. And 2, that even experienced pilots sometimes screw up the go-around. So it's probably worthy of your attention and your time to go practice it when you're out flying. So definitely think about practicing go-arounds. Now, I started thinking about this topic probably a week ago after I saw an article by Peter Garrison in Flying Magazine. It was called Why You Should Get to Know Your Airplane at Its Worst. And I'll put a link to that article in the show notes. And in that article, he said that he had written in the prior month about a fatal accident that resulted from the pilot's mishandling of a balked landing. And I'll talk about that accident in a moment. He said, I reflected that I have never assessed the behavior of my own airplane in that maneuver. As I've said before, my idea of flight testing is to take trips and wait for something strange to happen. And as luck would have it, I have never yet had a balked landing in Melmoth 2. Now, that's an experimental aircraft that he designed and built. And he talked a little bit about how changing configuration at low speed is not always an easy thing to do. He said that in the early Cessna 150s and 172s, for example, that they were notoriously unable to gain speed with full flaps, and that you had to bleed the flaps up very carefully while you waited for the diminishing drag to allow the airplane to very gradually accelerate. And he said if you had to turn or climb to avoid an obstacle, you were in a bad fix. Now, by bleed the flaps, what Garrison means is that on a Cessna, you're going to first raise them to 20 degrees when you're doing a go-around. You'll let the airplane continue to accelerate and climb. Then when it has a positive rate of climb, you're going to raise the flaps again up to 10 degrees. You're going to wait until you finally have a positive rate of climb again, and then raise the flaps to 0 degrees. But often pilots forget to raise the flaps in increments like this, and they'll go straight from full flaps to the flaps 0 position. And invariably, that's going to cause your aircraft to sink, possibly hitting the ground, or the runway. So that's an issue if you don't perform the flap removal correctly. Now, Peter said that at altitude, in terms of testing Melmoth 2, he said, I configured for landing and set up a 500 foot per minute descent at an approach speed of 73 knots. This required about 18 inches of manifold pressure. I then pretended that an elk had strolled out onto the imaginary runway in front of me. I arrested the descent while bringing the power up to 26 inches of manifold pressure and started cleaning up the airplane. He said it was quite a complex routine. He described the various changes in pitch as he raised the flaps and retracted the air brakes. And he said he had the same problem as the Cessna 150 pilot, which was not enough hands. And he talked in detail in the article about why most planes have pitch changes as you change the flap position. And if you want to know about all the aerodynamic forces involved, which he talked about in great detail, I put a link to his article in the show notes. Just look for the link to Peter Garrison's Flying Magazine article. Now, at the beginning of the article, the accident he referred to that he had written about in the prior month was an SR20 Cirrus that had crashed at the Houston Hobby Airport in 2016 after making a number of attempts to land in which the tower controller kept issuing go-arounds because there was other faster traffic landing and reassigning different runways. And it really was just amazing to listen to the transcripts of those, to see how many times this poor pilot was forced to go around to accommodate faster aircraft. And I had heard about this accident many times in the past, and I knew that the aircraft ultimately entered a spin after one of the go-arounds and it crashed, killing everybody on board. But what I hadn't heard was the actual cause of the accident. Now, Peter wrote in the early article that the immediate cause for the loss of control was that the pilot, thinking she was too high to land, decided to go around. So far, so good. He says she retracted the flaps without first gaining speed. The pilot retracted the flaps at an indicated airspeed of 60 knots. Now, the flaps-up stall speed of the SR20 in a 15-degree bank is between 70 and 75 knots. So he says it was bound to stall as soon as the flaps began to move. Now, my comment on this is, first of all, 60 knots is way too slow for a Cirrus to be climbing out at. In fact, the approach speed on the Cirrus for short field landing, the SR20, is going to be either 75 knots or 78, depending upon the vintage of the Cirrus. And VY climb speed is going to be 96. So about the slowest you'd ever climb out would be 75 knots. And so that says that this pilot was probably a good 21 knots too slow compared to VY. Now, the SR20 POH states that after a go-around, the plane must be accelerated to between 81 and 83 knots before raising the flaps. And again, this pilot was way, way, way below that speed when she raised the flaps. And unfortunately, that was what led to that particular fatal accident. Now let's talk about other go-around related accidents. This one was from April 2016 in Boone, North Carolina, in which a private pilot and two passengers were conducting a local flight from the pilot's home airport. And this comes straight from the NTSB's final report. And it says, one witness stated that his attention was drawn to the airplane due to its very fast landing approach. He said the airplane then disappeared from view, and shortly thereafter he saw a plume of smoke in the area of a golf course on the northwest side of the airport. Several witnesses on the golf course stated that the airplane appeared to be taking off and noted that it was struggling, that it was too low, and was bobbing up and down. The airplane impacted a stand of 75-foot tall pine trees and came to rest on the golf course where a post-crash fire consumed it. Now, the landing runway was measured at 2,700 feet long by about 40 feet wide. And they say, given that the witness observation of the airplane's fast approach speed, NTSB says it's likely the pilot initiated a go-around due to excessive airspeed and or a lack of runway remaining on which to stop. Now, they say had the pilot started the go-around earlier after recognizing the airplane's unstabilized approach due to excessive airspeed, the pilot would have had more time to reconfigure the airplane, establish a positive rate of climb, and clear the trees near the end of the runway. Now, the NTSB said the probable cause was the pilot's delayed decision to conduct a go-around following an unstabilized landing approach and his subsequent failure to maintain clearance from trees near the end of the runway. And if you think it's just general aviation pilots that have go-around related accidents, I just found an article from flightglobal.com from September 2016 about an Emirates Boeing 777 that was destroyed while attempting to do a go-around at Dubai. And I'll put a link in the article to the show notes. This aircraft had touched down some 1,100 meters or about 3,600 feet beyond the threshold of the runway 12 left, after a tailwind on approach started transitioning to a headwind. The General Civil Aviation Authority investigators state that as the 777 touched down with its engines at idle power, the crew received an oral warning that the jet had landed long. The crew opted to execute a go-around, and the aircraft became airborne 4 seconds after the warning. Its flaps started to retract to the 20 position, the normal go-around setting, some 4 seconds after that, and the landing gear lever was activated 2 seconds later to raise the landing gear. Now, crucially, the inquiry does not mention whether the takeoff go-around switch normally used to command the go-around thrust for the engines was activated. But according to the article in Flight Global, the investigators point out that these switches on the 777 are inhibited once the aircraft's landing gear touches down. In this situation, the crew must manually advance the thrust levers to command go-around power. The inquiry indicates that the Emirates aircraft was still operating with idle thrust and decelerating as it attempted to climb away. It was subject to a headwind and reached a height of about 85 feet before it began to sink back to the runway. Both pilots realized the airspeed was decreasing and the thrust levers were suddenly pushed from the idle setting to the full forward position. But the thrust command was too late to arrest the 900 foot per minute sink, and the aircraft pitched up almost 10 degrees nose up, traveling at 125 knots, and struck the runway with its aft fuselage about 1 second after the engine power began to increase. As the landing gear was still undergoing retraction, the 777 contacted the runway with its Rolls-Royce Trent 800 engines, one of which was detached as the aircraft slid to a halt. The landing gear would normally only be retracted during a go-around once the crew had confirmed that the aircraft had achieved positive climb. The aircraft, which was arriving as flight EK-51, was destroyed by fire, but all 282 passengers and 18 crew members escaped. And now switching back to general aviation, I recently read about an accident that occurred last month in April 2018 at the Aeroflex Andover Airport in Andover, New Jersey. And it reminded me of an incident that I had at that very airport 30 years ago when I lived in Bud Lake, New Jersey. Now, this airport is unique in that it's relatively short, just 1981 feet long and 50 feet wide. So it's not a big deal, you might think, because, hey, you've probably flown into airports that are that short before. And I would agree, actually, I learned to fly in an airport that had 1,800 feet of runway. But what that runway didn't have, which they have at Andover, is 2 lakes, one at each end of the runway. So if you happen to land long and run off the end of the runway, your plane is going to go into one of those 2 lakes, depending upon which runway you were landing on. Well, 30 years ago, I was in a rented Cessna 172 with my coworker, Charlie Rothschild from Hewlett-Packard, and I was in the left seat flying. And when I landed at Andover, I was probably high or fast, as I didn't land near the numbers. I landed perhaps, I'm guessing, halfway down the runway. And my friend Charlie, who was a more experienced flyer at the time, said something like, "Do you want to go around?" And I recall saying something that makes me cringe today when I hear other pilots say it to me. I said something like, "No, I can do it." So after the touchdown, I braked like crazy and the tires are squealing. As I approached the end of the runway, I could actually see people standing nearby who were watching me. And I knew why, because I'm sure while they certainly didn't wish me any harm, they probably decided if I was going to run off into the lake, they didn't want to miss seeing that. Anyway, luckily for me, I got the airplane stopped at pretty much the very end of the runway through, I would say, sheer luck, which avoided that accident. And, of course, I said something to Charlie like, "See, I was able to do it," to which he replied, "Yes, but what if the brakes had failed?" And I remember thinking, wow, I never thought of that. So I know I got lucky that day, and these days I'm a lot more experienced as a pilot. And if I were in that same situation today, I definitely would have done a go-around. Because frankly, there's just no point in scaring yourself and having to rely on luck to save you from situations like that. Now, last week, apparently a similar accident happened in Knoxville, Tennessee. The NTSB hasn't yet posted the preliminary report, but there are newspaper articles and tweets from the Knoxville Fire Department about the incident. It occurred at the Knoxville Downtown Island Airport. Now, I have actually flown over this airport and looked down at it, but I never realized that it's an island and that both ends of the runway lead directly to the Tennessee River. Now, this airport's longer. It's 3,500 feet long, and this accident occurred at night at 9:15 p.m., and the approach to one of the runways is over farm fields, so it would have been very dark on final to that runway. And according to a tweet from the fire department, quote, "At 9:15 this evening, Cirrus SR20 single-engine overshoots island home runway. No injuries. Pilot, 66-year-old male based here in Knoxville." And there's a photo of the plane with its nose submerged in the water, and it looks like the tail is still up on the land. Now, I went and checked FlightAware.com, and it shows that the pilot had just returned from a 2-hour flight from Hilton Head Island, South Carolina. So the incident almost certainly occurred after a landing, as the time on FlightAware is fairly close to the time that the fire department said the incident occurred. So while we don't have the details, it's quite probable that the pilot landed long, may have figured, hey, I can do this, I can make this work, but unfortunately was wrong and went off the end of the runway. And if that's what happened, most likely all of that could have been avoided by a timely go-around. And speaking of go-arounds, we talked extensively last year about the Air Canada incident last year, in which an Airbus landing at San Francisco lined up at night with a taxiway, and they were less than 50 feet above 4 airplanes on the taxiway when the pilot finally figured something wasn't right and initiated what was really a very late go-around. Now, with 4 fully loaded aircraft on the taxiway, that go-around, as late as it was, may have avoided what could have been the largest disaster in aviation history. So all I can say is thank goodness the pilot did do a go-around rather than think, I can do this, I can make this work, because some landings just aren't meant to be saved. So what are the elements of a go-around? Well, they vary for each aircraft, but most go-arounds have a lot in common. Generally, the first step is to go to full throttle. And as you put in throttle, you want to simultaneously add right rudder. I tell pilots that you want the entire right side of your body working together. So as your right hand moves forward to push in the throttle, your right foot moves forward at the same time to apply right rudder. Then, generally, you want to pitch for climb and remove some, but not all of the flaps. As I mentioned before, if you remove all the flaps at one time, the aircraft will sink back toward the ground. Now, later, as the aircraft accelerates and you get a positive rate of climb, you can continue to raise the flap in increments, but you don't want to rush that process. Now, if the aircraft has retractable gear, then you'll have to refer to the manual to learn the exact order for retracting the flaps versus the landing gear, as it will be different in different aircraft. So, for example, in some planes, you may be required to first raise the flaps one increment, then raise the landing gear, and then continue raising the flaps in increments. Now, let's talk about some of the common errors that I see when pilots execute a go-around. The first is that they are too late deciding to go around, or worse, they never decide to go around, and I have to tell them to go around. For example, I remember an SR20 pilot doing a power-off landing to a runway in which he had a very high sink rate. He was at a relatively low altitude as he was completing his turn to final over the runway, and it was clear to me that we were going to touch down very hard and that we're going to be misaligned with the runway. So I had to call for the go-around, and the plane did touch down briefly on one wheel, but if I hadn't called for the go-around, I'm certain the aircraft would have been damaged. And earlier this week, I was flying with a student pilot who was working on crosswind landings, and I called for multiple go-arounds on that flight. One, because we had a very high sink rate and would have hit the ground hard. Another, because during the flare, the pilot pulled back too much and the airplane ballooned back up into the air. And in that case, the aircraft was slow, and as it ballooned up, it lost almost all of its energy, being that it was about to stall and drop maybe, I'm guessing, 7-8 feet down to the runway, which again could have damaged the aircraft. So I immediately called for a go-around. And in the third instance, the pilot had drifted to the far left edge of the runway because of the crosswind just before we entered the flare, and we were dangerously close to the edge of the runway. So again, I called for a go-around. Now, sometimes when I call go-around, the pilot does nothing, and I'll wait 1 or 2 seconds, and I'll call go around again a second time. I usually do it in a fairly serious voice so people realize, hey, this is important, you got to do it now. But I must say I've never had to say it a third time, because by then I am pushing the pilot's hand all the way in on the throttle to add power myself. Now, another common error I see is that pilots will just jam that throttle in too fast during a go-around. And some of the large engines will really choke and stumble because you're ending up flooding them with too much fuel if you just jam that throttle in instantly. And if you're in a high-performance aircraft like a Cirrus SR20 or a Columbia 400, if you jam that throttle in fast, you're also going to have to be very quick and very precise with your simultaneous application of right rudder. And if you don't apply that rudder and you're close to the ground, you could catch a wingtip, and that will frankly cause the airplane to cartwheel, and that may be the last thing you ever see in this lifetime. So it really pays to take maybe 1-2 seconds to push that throttle in a little bit more slowly and then apply right rudder simultaneously as you push in the throttle. That'll make it easier to get the right amount of rudder in as well. Now, surprisingly, one of the most common errors I see in a go-around is that after a pilot puts in the throttle, they just continue to fly level. It just baffles me. They don't pitch up and climb away from the runway. Now, if you're doing a go-around, you don't want to stay next to the ground. You want to climb. And you don't want to be doing a very, very slow, gradual climb. You want to get away from the ground now. So you should be trying to pitch to climb at VY, the speed that gives you the best rate of climb for your airplane. Now, I see the same thing happen when people are descending into the traffic pattern. They'll add power to level off, but they don't raise the nose up, and then they descend below the traffic pattern altitude. So people, all I can say is you've got two hands. I want you to remember to use both of them, one for the power and one to pitch up the nose whenever you're initiating a go-around or whenever you're level off as you're descending down to the traffic pattern altitude. And perhaps the most common error of all, well, it's the flaps. Earlier this week, I was flying with a pilot who was working on his instrument rating. We flew the ILS-25 right into Livermore, California. Now, he flew below the glide slope as we were getting close to minimums, and I told him to go around. And about that time when we would normally during the climb up be retracting the flaps, the tower called us and told us to switch to the other tower frequency, as Livermore has two separate tower frequency, and when they get busy, they'll start to use both of them. And later, I noticed when we leveled off that the aircraft wasn't as fast as I expected, but I rationalized that away by thinking, well, we've just leveled off. We haven't had time to accelerate to cruise speed. And of course, that rationalization was wrong. The flaps were still down, and we had both missed it. And I think it was because we were distracted by the frequency change, which was totally unexpected and frankly almost never happens at Livermore. So you really want to watch out for things that occur unexpectedly, especially during the go-around, as they may distract you from your routine and cause you to forget something important. Finally, another mistake I sometimes see when people go around is that they fail to track the runway and its extended center line as they climb up during a go-around. This can cause you to hit lights or signs or other obstacles when you're close to the ground. And worse, as you climb out, you could also fly into trees, especially if you were late initiating the go-around. So the next time you go out and fly, please, please, please practice doing some go-arounds. Remember to push the throttle in over maybe 1 to 2 seconds as you simultaneously apply right rudder. Just think of that whole right side of the body working together. And then pitch the aircraft for climb. Finally, raise the flaps and the landing gear in accordance with the POH for your airplane. And remember that initiating a go-around early can save you a lot of grief and a lot of money. There's no shame in doing a go-around, and good pilots know that executing a go-around can get you out of a lot of bad situations quickly. Now, I know I mentioned this in a previous episode, but a flying club I fly with analyzed their accidents, and they concluded that 80% of them could have been avoided by an early go-around. And I think I also mentioned that as a young pilot, I often had trouble deciding to go around, and I go back and forth in my mind about whether to go around, and I would just hem and haw. Should I go around? No. Should I go around? And finally, the best advice I ever read was that the moment you first start to think, maybe I should go around, that's when you should initiate the go around. So don't hem and haw like I do. As soon as it comes into your mind, just do it. I hope this discussion has been helpful for you, and please, please, please go around early and often to avoid potential accidents. Coming up next, lots of listener feedback and questions. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Hey, a quick thank you to people who left reviews for the Apple Podcast app, formerly called iTunes. BGINNC said that the show is a must for all pilots. He said, I'm a much better pilot because of your podcast. Thanks, Max. Well, you are welcome, and thanks for your review. And Levin IMC, Leven IMC, says, excellent way to stay up to date. He said his CFI recommended the podcast and that he really enjoyed learning about all the changes that the FAA has made for non-towered traffic pattern entry. And he says, as a student pilot, I've been looking for a good GA podcast to keep up to date on the happenings of the aviation world, and this is it. To which I say, hey, we are all student pilots. I try to learn something every time that I'm out there, and I hope that you do too. Also, longtime listeners know that we have a dedicated podcast app in the Apple App Store and also in the Google Play Store. And there was a new review from Love IFR for our dedicated podcast app. He says, in part, this app makes it very easy to hear new and old episodes. Keep up the great work. And that's true. With the app, it's very easy to just swipe left, swipe right, and you can get from one episode to another very, very quickly. So if you haven't tried that out, go out to either the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store. Type in Aviation News Talk, 3 separate words, and you can download our free dedicated app. Let's go to listener feedback. This comes from Ron in Utah. He says, hello, Max. Been listening to your show from the beginning. Love the format, length, and content. He said, I just finished the CFI shortage episode with Jason Blair. I agree it was quite difficult to find an instructor meeting the qualifications for training an initial instructor, which was 200 hours of instruction and 24 months holding a CFI ticket, which means it's hard to find instructors who can teach instructors. He says, a lot of places providing instruction are having a hard time finding the people meeting those qualifications, as by the time one instructor might meet the minimum qualifications, they are on their way to other aviation endeavors. And thank you for that, Ron. I wrote back to him and I told him that I personally was experiencing the CFI shortage. The only break I'd been able to get from flying was to get sick for the past week. Now, that was a little while ago when he sent that in. But again, thanks, Ron, for your email. And here's an email from Eric, who is one of our anonymous PayPal sponsors. And I should mention, if you'd like to donate to the show, you don't have to do it through Patreon. Just send me an email and I'll send you a link to where you can send a PayPal donation. Anyway, Eric says, hey, Max, I was just listening to your latest podcast about entering the traffic pattern, and a piece of advice about not performing S-turns on final was quite coincident with an experience I had last Wednesday coming into my towered home airport. He said he was in an SR-22T and he was behind what had to have been one of the 162 Skycatchers from the local flight training school. The controller had cleared me to land number 2 behind the Cessna, but I was very close, perhaps a half mile to a quarter mile behind the Cessna on final, probably when I was 2 miles out. He said I started to perform S-turns after notifying the tower that I was going to do that for spacing. The tower responded with the option to perform a 360. I figured I could get enough spacing with S-turns, but the 162 was slowing down even more. I put out full flaps and minimum speed, 80 to 85 knots. Needless to say, my approach was not even close to stabilized. I managed to work out the landing, but in retrospect, I really should have taken the option on the 360 when I had the opportunity. Thanks for the podcast. It makes my evening walks way more tolerable. That's great, Eric. Thanks so much for the feedback. And yes, I think that if it's possible, doing a 360 is probably a lot more stable than to have to do S-turns, which are going to take you on and off of the final. So good idea there. And here's an email from friend of the show, senior editor of Flying Magazine, Rob Mark. And by the way, senior editor doesn't mean he's old. It means he's just very good at his job. Anyway, Rob said, listening to episode number 60, pretty ambitious purchase for a student pilot. Curious how much that fellow will have in the SR-22 when he takes his check ride. Well, Rob, you've made an assumption there. He is actually taking his check ride in the Archer that he has been learning to fly in all along, and he is holding off spending much time in that SR-22 until after he gets his check ride, which I think makes a whole lot of sense. You don't really want to kind of switch airplanes in the middle of your student pilot training. Makes sense to, once you decide which airplane to do it in, to stick to that one. And that's what he's doing. So he will be getting lots of flight instruction. In fact, he told me he already has gotten some from a local Cirrus CSIP, but that he's going to hold off doing much work in the SR-22 until after his check ride in the Archer. Now let's look at listener questions.
Hi, Max. This is John Weisswasser from Montclair, New Jersey. Quick question about your use of instrument flight plans on long cross-country flights. I've noticed on a lot of your longer cross-country ferry flights that you tend to go VFR. I personally tend to always file whenever I fly beyond, say, 100 nautical miles from my origin. And the reason I do this, even if the conditions are visual, is so that I can make use of the system, the quote-unquote system, that enables me to not worry about airspace, TFRs, traffic. I have someone to talk to if there's an emergency. And while it may add another 5 or 10 minutes on the flight as far as routing is concerned, I find that overall there's a general benefit. I'm curious as to what your philosophy is on this, and would love to hear from you. Love the show. Keep it up. Talk soon.
John, thanks so much. Great to hear from you. And thank you for taking the time to record your question. For anybody else who wants to record a question, please go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on listener questions, record your question. I'll play it here on the show. John, you brought up a number of different points there. You said that with your IFR, you get to make use of the system. When I fly VFR, I'm getting some of the same benefits you're doing because I almost always get flight following. So, for example, you mentioned traffic, which we get when we're flying VFR. You said someone to talk to in emergencies, which we also have. And I would say you mentioned airspace. Well, you're flying in the crowded Northeast corridor where I spent probably the first 10 years of my flying career, so I'm familiar with that. Most of my trips are going east-west, and frankly, the airspace is just a lot simpler. And so whereas if you were IFR in the Northeast, they could not dump you if they were busy. They could dump you if you were VFR. I find that on my trips going across the country east-west, even if I'm VFR, they never dump me because they're so busy with other aircraft. In fact, there are times when we're flying across the country where we'll be in a sector for 10, 15, 20 minutes where we're the only person on frequency. And so I would say our airspace is just a lot simpler as we go east-west across the country. And so that makes it a little bit easier to be VFR. Plus, it gives me a lot more flexibility in altitude. And that's important because some of our MEAs out here in the West are going to be up 11,000, 12,000 feet high. Many of the aircraft that I'm flying do not have oxygen systems. Now, I know you're flying a turbine aircraft that's pressurized, so you don't have to worry about that. I find that if I'm up around 10,000 feet for an hour or two, I'm starting to feel a little dull, listless. I'm just not as sharp. So I generally try to stick around, 7,500 feet. But when I'm crossing these mountains out in the west, I like being VFR because I can often be below the MEAs. Maybe I'm flying at 9,500 or 10,500 instead of up at 11,000 or 12,000 feet where there's less oxygen. And another thing is that sometimes when we've got clouds and I might consider flying IFR, it's just too cold. There's ice in those clouds. And so by staying VFR, I can pick my own altitude, which often will be lower than those clouds. And that way I can avoid the icing. Whereas if I were IFR, I would have to, be picking up ice and running TKS fluid, which if I have is certainly going to be limited. And if I don't have it, of course, is going to be a problem. So I do fly IFR when we've got clouds and when the temperatures are warm enough to be in the clouds. But most of the rest of the time, I'll fly VFR. It does save a little bit of time, gives us more flexibility in terms of our routing and in terms of our altitude. And with that, let me encourage you to listen to bloopers at the end of the show. And please, if you would, take just a moment to think of one or two friends who you think might enjoy the show, if only they knew about it. So go ahead and let them know. Contact them today. Tell them how to find the show. And by the way, that's how most people find the show, is when someone like you tells somebody else about it. And if your friend is not familiar with what a podcast is, just send them to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store to download our dedicated Aviation News Talk podcast app. And hey, if you think that someday you might buy a new or slightly used Cirrus, please contact me now. And I must say, I'm a little behind in my email. If you've contacted me about a new or used Cirrus and I haven't gotten back to you, ping me again. Anyway, I can help arrange a free demo flight if you're thinking about a new Cirrus and help you understand the many factors, not all of which are obvious when you're considering new versus slightly used. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the world. Until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. This app makes it very easy to hear new and old episodes, and that's absolutely true. You just swipe left and swipe